we welcome you this evening to today's conversation in collaboration with the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. The theme for this academic year series of talks centers on the notion of power, who has it, who wields it, and who contests it, all themes which remain relevant in today's Latin America. Throughout this year, we seek to complicate our understanding of power, and especially what it means within a Mexican context. Today is a treat, because we can explore this idea from the vantage point of two Latin American countries, Mexico and Colombia. The roadmap for today's event will be as follows. After brief introductory remarks, I will then introduce today's speakers. Each will give a brief 7 or so minute presentation on some key themes of their books. We will then have an engaged discussion seeking to find parallels and contradictions when we put their work side by side. After this, we will then, time permitting, open the floor to questions. It seemed appropriate that we begin this year's programming with two scholars whose methodology and approach to history challenges how we understand who governs the global economy. Indeed, both their books push us to rethink who gets to sit at the proverbial table of governance, set agendas, and envision, indeed build a new future. What these two scholars illustrate with their work is that who were and are the world makers is not as clear-cut as it seems. At the core, both works examine social and economic ideas and follow them to meetings in Paris, Cali, Mexico City, and Washington, while examining how these ideas of governance and self-help are transformed on the ground from agricultural fields to housing projects. The mid-20th century ushered in the era of development, when areas of the world could, it seemed, be transformed by experts with economic models that stretch from office buildings in Washington to potato fields in the Andes. As Professor Offner describes, development also conferred a new power to economics. More than a field of expertise, it, quote, became a popular language of legitimation that pointed to many possible ends, end quote. Everything, it seemed, could and should be transformed, from access to irrigation to universities. Yet Professor Thornton pushes our timeline earlier than the mid-20th century. For, she argues, to understand the roots of development ideas, we need to first understand a world that was being remade, not after the Second World War, but after the First. They both show us that it is not just ideas that circulate, but it is the same corporations and individuals who continue to appear and reappear across the hemisphere and indeed the world, such as, for example, Depression-era policies for new problems in the 1960s. In fact, the architects of bold social programs in the US, such as the New Dealers, apparently don't retire. They just move themselves and their ideas of social transformation to Latin America. But something happened in this move. The ideas and rationale that were used to build a welfare state in the United States are instead used to decentralize the state, to implement austere programs of social welfare. How and why? That is what today's speakers will help us to understand. It is a real pleasure to open up the conversation, Rethinking Latin America on a Global Scale, with Professors Christy Thornton and Amy Offner. So I will begin by introducing Professor Christy Thornton, who's the author of Revolution and Development, Mexico and the Governance of the Global Economy. Professor Thornton is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University, where she serves as a core faculty member for the Latin America in a Globalizing World initiative and is affiliated with the program in Latin American Studies. Her research interests include comparative historical sociology, global inequality and development, labor and social movements, Latin American political economy, and Mexican state formation. She has been a visiting fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. She was previously an assistant professor of history and international studies at Rowan University and the executive director of the North American Congress on Latin America, NACLA. She holds a PhD from New York University, a master's in international affairs from Columbia University, and a BA from Barnard College. Professor Thornton, we welcome you tonight.
Gabriela, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who assisted in organizing this. Thank you to Mauricio. Thank you to Diane for the invitation. Thank you, of course, to Dr. Klaas and to the Weatherhead Center for having us here. I'm really excited about this conversation. I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint because now that I sit over here in sociology, I've been sort of fully interpolated into sociological ways of doing this. So I have to talk to you through this PowerPoint over here. What I'm going to do very briefly is attempt to give a kind of primer of the arguments of the book for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet. And in doing so, I'm going to highlight kind of two main interventions. First, in the historiography and the social scientific literature on the origins of development, as Gabriela mentioned. And second, in our understandings of the creation of the developmental state in post-revolutionary Mexico. It works. So we have this kind of conventional story for the origins of development as an international project, right? Which argues that at the close of the Second World War, US and European colonial powers thought up these new institutions to consolidate their control over the emerging third world. And this is in a situation of both rapid decolonization and rising US hegemony. And so in this version, we tend to see as protagonists various kinds of great men from the global north, people like Harry Dexter White of the US Treasury Department, or US President Harry Truman, right, who promulgates the .4 program for technical assistance in 1949. My book really rejects this conventional narrative to instead show that development was, beginning as early as the 1920s, a demand made by countries like Mexico, who sought a real reordering of the world economy in the aftermath of First World War I, then the Great Depression, and then World War II. And that reordering, that kind of world making, as Gabriela used our colleague Adam Getachu's fantastic idea for what this looks like. The particular mode that the Mexican representatives who I trace in the book use is that they're arguing for the creation of kind of new institutions and arrangements that will afford them both representation within global organizations and redistribution through global institutions. We've ignored this history, I think, about the origins of development for a number of reasons, both in the literature and in the world, right? One important source of our total ignorance of the history that I've sort of recovered in this book is the kind of enormous condescension of the historical actors who interacted with these Mexican and other Latin American officials as they put forth these new ideas and new demands about international development. I'm sharing this quote on the screen because it's one of my favorite that I encountered while I was researching. I found this in the UK National Archives as the British representatives, together with the American representatives, prepared for the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, which of course created the World Bank and the IMF. British representatives, including the famous British economist John Maynard Keynes, were really upset that the Americans had decided to include so many Latin Americans in the process. Latin American representatives made up fully 18 of the 44 countries invited to that conference. And so the British kind of couldn't understand what it was that these Latin Americans were doing there. And so you have this British Treasury official write to his superior this. He says, "It's also silly to make the pretense that the Mexicans," parentheses, even though their representative in July was, I understand, a graduate of the London School of Economics, and the Brazilians would discuss at the expert level a document which the American Treasury was endorsing. Their function is to sign in the place for the signature. To compare that consultation with the consultation with the Belgians and the Dutch, which Harry Dexter White, seems to suggest we might do, is part of the gap in Dr. White's understanding of the practical way in which international exchange works. So I think that while today, you know, the kind of racialized assumptions that undergird this kind of dismissal of the idea that a Mexican or a Brazilian economist could ever be as prepared as a Dutch or a Belgian one, even if they graduate from the London School of Economics, right? We would find this preposterous today, right? But I do think that a great deal of our scholarship and our kind of theoretical frameworks with which we approach this history has in fact sort of echoed some of these presumptions, right? That the Mexicans, the Brazilians, Latin Americans, countries from the global South, what could they possibly contribute? What could they be doing there, right? So some of the arguments that my book makes, one of the important arguments that my book makes, is that we need to understand this long history of Latin American and particularly Mexican agitation for an international development apparatus in the period before World War II, and to see the institutions that emerged in the post-war era as, in really important ways, reactions to those demands, right? And so this requires understanding what the Mexican representatives, when they sat down to kind of look at the Bretton Woods plans, they argued for taking very seriously the situation, needs, and wishes of the debtor countries in the process of economic development, anxious to accelerate their progress, which at the end of the day are the majority of those that exist, right? They're arguing that we have to take seriously these views from the global South, from Latin America. And so my book really tries to follow from that impetus. The second intervention that my book tries to make has to do more with the scholarship on Mexico in particular. So I am trying to revise the scholarship about the origins of development and what that actually looks like and where those ideas come from. But I'm also making an intervention into the literature about the Mexican post-revolutionary developmental state. Most of our analyses of the developmental state in Mexico look at Mexican revolutionary nationalism or nationally scaled projects, and indeed frequently actually at regionally and locally scaled projects. But I wanted to understand why Mexico makes the interventions it does over time and what the results were for Mexican developmentalism, what the causes and consequences of Mexican economic internationalism were in addition. I do this by considering Mexico's relation to the system of international finance. And here, the argument is that Mexico's exclusion from that system from the 1910s through the early 1940s really shapes their early and more radical interventions from their vision of institutions that would promote international economic justice, right? That really derives from this exclusion from the system as it was set up. After they work to become reincorporated into that system to have new access to international finance, however, they become more cautious. These Mexican state officials step back from their leadership role on trying to reform the institutions of the global economy, and they frequently quietly and behind the scenes support the status quo, right? And this is an interpretive difference that I have with some other historians of Mexican foreign relations in the period, where I see a real retreat for the kind of Mexican leadership in the economic governance at this moment. In the 1970s, then, what we get is an attempt to kind of synthesize these two histories, the kind of radical reformist vision of the 1930s and 1940s, and the attempt to kind of remain a good credit risk, to remain in good standing within the international financial system. And we get that kind of what I call the Echeverría synthesis in the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States. So I do think there's much more to be said about this history, and particularly this moment in the 1970s, which we'll talk about why it's so important in both of our books. The ways that confrontation between North and South, culminating in this famous meeting in Cancun, the North-South Summit in 1981, and then the subsequent Mexican debt crisis, which will subsequently give way to structural adjustment and the Washington Consensus, right? How these moments really shaped the world as we know it today. The questions of redistribution of resources, development in global capitalism, and in the constraints of these international credit markets, these are still very much live questions. And I think the complicated and contradictory history of Mexico over the course of the 20th century can tell us a lot about how we got here, right? As President López Portillo says in the aftermath of that 1981 Cancun meeting, he says, tragic paradoxes were raised in Cancun that could not be solved. And I think that's a good distillation of the sort of studying the history of development. Tragic paradoxes were raised that could not be solved. And so I think in many ways we are still here in the world that came in the aftermath of this, trying to solve them. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for the chance to be here.
Thank you so much for that wonderful synthesis of such a rich book. And I love this notion of tragic paradoxes. And we're going to be talking about that in our conversation. For those of you just joining us right now, we will start our conversation after Professor Offner gives us a brief 7 or so minute summary of her book. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We will get to those after our conversation. It's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Amy Offner from the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Offner is Associate Professor in the Department of History. She studies 20th century US history in global perspective with special focus on Latin America, the history of capitalism and political economy, empire and foreign relations, and social and intellectual history. Her book, Sorting Out the Mixed Economy, won book prizes from the Economic History Society, the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, the Latin American and Caribbean section of the Southern Historical Association, and the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics. Congratulations on that, Amy. She holds a PhD from Columbia University before beginning graduate studies. She worked as a union organizer and an editor at Dollars and Cents, a magazine and book publisher analyzing economic affairs. I pass it on to you.
Thanks so much for this invitation. Thanks for organizing this, Gabriela and Mauricio. Thanks to Christy for that fabulous summary of a really fantastic book. I'll give a brief overview of what the book is about. Sorting Out the Mixed Economy is a book that travels through river valleys and housing complexes, job training centers, economic planning offices, college classrooms, in order to understand how governments in the capitalist economies of Colombia and the United States first took on widening functions during the decades after 1945, and then how their functions were dismantled, reassigned, and redefined after the 1970s. And the book ultimately makes two central points. So first, it reveals the influence of Latin American developmentalism on the formation of the US welfare state and on the wider intellectual and political life of the North Atlantic. In that sense, it takes a central insight of post-colonial studies, the idea that imperialism shapes metropoles, and it applies that idea to the history of the United States. Second, the book argues that a number of practices that we tend to regard today as quintessentially neoliberal inventions actually had earlier lives as developmentalist phenomena. So it finds things that we tend not to remember about mid-century statecraft. It finds austere systems of social welfare provision. It finds evolving methods of state decentralization, novel forms of for-profit and private delegation of state functions. And the book concludes that capitalism in the late 20th century wasn't built in simple reaction against Keynesianism and developmentalism. Instead, it was a parasitic formation that appropriated and redeployed key elements of the very order that it destroyed. This argument was my attempt to resolve what had, for me, become really confounding puzzles within the burgeoning literature on the origins of neoliberalism. Most writing on that subject depicts the 1970s and 1980s as a moment of cataclysmic rupture, when spectacularly marginal ideas and practices obliterated everything that had come before. Much of the literature also suggests that those ideas originated in the North Atlantic and mainly among intellectual and political communities on the right. I think that there's a lot of truth in those stories, but I think that for all that those accounts have taught us, they leave us with some perplexing problems. Many purportedly novel practices of the late 20th century, including the techniques of state restructuring and social welfare provision that my book analyzes, actually had really long and tangled roots that extended into welfare and developmental states themselves. So my book presents a different understanding of how political economic configurations give way, one that recognizes Latin America as a vital source of ideas, one that highlights contradictions within mid-century capitalism, and one that accounts for continuities between successive forms of capitalism. So what I want to do is give you the tiniest taste of this research by looking at just one practice that was important in building Colombia's developmental state, then became adapted in the North Atlantic, and eventually became redeployed to take apart mid-century states in both regions. And that practice is state decentralization. It is, to me, a very curious fact that both the making and the unmaking of welfare and developmental states relied on forms of state decentralization that their champions in the moment hailed as historically unprecedented. Decentralization was actually an enduring and characteristic form of government in the Americas by the time of the Great Depression. And I argued that it was reimagined and redeployed twice during the subsequent years. First, as a developmentalist prescription to expand the responsibilities of weak states, and then later as an instrument to break down existing state functions. So I begin the book by looking out for one example of this, the birth of Colombia's first regional development corporation, the Cauca Valley Corporation, or the CVC. It was founded in 1954. It was a River Valley development agency of the mid-century period, and it was spearheaded by Colombian capitalists in the Cauca Valley, one of the richest agricultural regions, not just of Colombia, but all of Latin America. And these local capitalists enlisted support from the United States and the World Bank. And interestingly, they mobilized stories about the New Deal. They mobilized stories about the Tennessee Valley Authority, this iconic New Deal agency, to impress their own lessons on the Colombian government. They said that the TVA had demonstrated the value of decentralized public administration, and they forced the Colombian government to devolve an extraordinary range of powers to the CVC in the name of national development. The CVC articulated a really time-bound conception of decentralization, not the same one that was articulated in the 80s and 90s. So in the 50s, the CVC's prescription had two aspects. First, creating the CVC required devolving national power to a regional body, and indeed inventing the natural region as a new jurisdiction in Colombian governance. And second, the CVC blurred the line between public and private authority as the state vested powers in private businessmen and remade public enterprise in the image of the for-profit private sector corporation. In the course of the book, threaded throughout, I follow Colombian and US participants in the CVC from the 50s to the 90s, and I'm interested in the lessons they took from this development agency. So on the one hand, I follow US businessmen who went back to the United States in the era of the war on poverty, and they adapted the CVC's impulse toward privatization to promote new forms of for-profit contracting in federal training and education programs. So this is sort of a new origin story for for-profit educational contracting in the US state. On the other hand, I also follow Colombian economists into the Bretton Woods institutions during the 80s and 90s, where they became architects of structural adjustment. At that point in their careers, they were redefining and reimagining and redeploying this old developmentalist prescription of decentralization to create a fundamentally new kind of decentralized state, one that first of all stripped power away from mid-century institutions that had once symbolized decentralization, and one that redistributed state functions for new purposes, to destroy the power of public sector unions, to cut public expenditures. So the result was a completely new kind of decentralized state, one that we tend to remember as a replacement for an old centralized system. But our memory of decentralization as this thoroughly novel practice of the 80s and 90s owes to the self-understanding and the storytelling of those economists who distinguished their new prescriptions from older ones by constructing a retrospective understanding of the mid-century state as a centralized behemoth. And in doing that, they obscured the origins of their own ideas, and they erased the long and tangled lineage of the practice they promoted. So what should we make of these observations? I'm not arguing in this book that neoliberalism capitalism started in the 50s in Colombia or anywhere else. I regard the political economic transformation of the late 20th century as a truly shattering event that inaugurated a very new kind of political economy. But what I think this history does is help us think about how political economic orders give way. Rather than imagine the rise of neoliberalism purely as the product of right-wing mobilization and unilateral southward projections of power by imperial institutions, my book suggests that we should study the rise of neoliberalism the way that historians study other epochal transformations: the Age of Revolutions, the era of slave emancipation, the crisis of the Great Depression. All of those upheavals remade societies not by inverting their every feature, but by extinguishing a few of their defining elements and breathing new life into others. All of them also were multi-sided transnational processes in which influence moved in many directions across lines of imperial, national, and social division. And all of them involved a great deal of narration in the moment and commemoration afterward that produced memories of old orders convenient to the projects that succeeded them. I regard our own world as the product of just such an epochal transformation, and I regard stories of total rupture and inversion as a form of memory of our time that actually undergirds contemporary political conflict while obscuring a great deal about the developmentalist past.
Thank you so much for that wonderful synthesis of just a really rich and complicated and beautifully written book. So the last point that you made really brings me to the first question that I want to ask both of you. And it touches on this notion of how we construct narratives and what are the truths and the quote unquote facts that emerge and that stay with us decades after. And to that question is, what was it for each of you in your cases that you're bringing up both public and private interest, different geographies, different chronologies, changing experts, but what was it at its core? What was at its core the problem of capitalist development as it was envisioned in the 20th century from each of your perspectives? Who would like to go first?
Well, I can start and just say, I've been thinking about this question a lot as I think about where the work that I've done fits into this field of development sociology. And so I'm reading a lot of sort of how sociologists have long understood development, the stories that we tell about it. And one of the kind of received wisdoms that we have about development, I really love this question. There's so many ways to answer it, but I think, for instance, post-development scholars whose influence, somebody like Arturo Escobar, right, whose influence is really massive across many kinds of literatures, right, would argue that the way development comes to be a kind of rhetorical, a discursive technology for reproducing the West and their particular ways of organizing society, which not only doesn't threaten the power of rich countries and their business interests, but in fact reinforces it, right, that locks in what we once called dependency, and that would be the main problem of how we understand development, right? I think that's a really conventional way that we've understood that for the last, say, 25 years in the literature. That answer, I think, though, assumes a kind of colonial false consciousness on the part of third world leaders, right? On the part of the adherence to the developmentalist idea, the developmental imaginary, right? So it's, a developmental, it's kind of a colonial false consciousness at best, and a kind of comprador entreguismo at worst, right? Like the idea that we just have these elites who are just selling out their people for this vision of development. And instead, I'm more interested in thinking about why this idea was so key to such a wide range of thinkers across a broad political spectrum, right? Liberals, socialists, communists. We had so many people in the 20th century across the world really believe deeply in development as a transformative and liberatory project. And so to me, the interesting question is, why did they think that, right? What did they think that development would do in that way? And in trying to excavate precisely when and why this idea emerges and how it gets pursued. And so this is a kind of alternative genealogy of development that somebody like Thandika Mkandawiri calls the Bandung version of development, as opposed to the Truman version of development, right? And so he's trying to understand a kind of longer genealogy in that way. And I think for me here, if we're gonna ask what's the core problem with that, it's that vision was blocked, foreclosed, and partially co-opted into a broader US-led system over time. And you can see, in the case of Mexico, how that transformation happens over the course of my book. And so that's one answer, is the way that it, a kind of emancipatory vision for development is put on the table and then actually foreclosed by powerful actors, right? Not that they kind of imagine development as this technology of control for arranging the world the way that they want it to look, but then in fact, more radical ideas about reforming the global economy are put on the table and fought back against, that there is a reaction to a demand, right? But there's another problem, even if that hadn't been the case, right? With what the kind of 20th century developmental state looks like in the Mexican case. And that's a question of the kind of limits of what that liberation could look like, right? Distribution within a country like Mexico, for example, where whole regions of the country and these sectors of the economy get left out of the so-called Mexican miracle, right? And so here, I think, part of the core problem of capitalist development is its inability to tackle the distribution question, right? The reliance on the growth dividend to kind of float all boats. Echeverria, for example, famously was defeated by the Mexican business class in his attempt to finally get the rich to pay their fair share of taxes. And instead, he turns to foreign lending to try to cover his social spending, right, with the results that we know. And so, the political science Theo Francos has talked about this in the context of resource nationalisms, how even left governments rely on this kind of export-oriented growth and the growth dividend instead of doing the hard work of fighting for redistribution and creating a fairer society at home. And in the Mexican case, I see that as really one of the core problems of the Mexican developmental state.
Thank you so much for that, Christy. Sorry, Amy, I just want to highlight something that I want to bring later to the conversation about. You bring at the end distribution and how there are so many people believing in development, but it's also about co-opted visions. And I want us to set that aside because that will lead us into to another point that we want to make. And Amy, sorry for cutting you off.
No, that's a great, I wanted to bring out that issue as well. I'll point to sort of what I see as two core problems with mid-century capitalism. One is anti-communism. I think that has a tremendous effect on narrowing people's political imaginations and narrowing what is possible in the first and the third worlds. And so, for instance, one of the things that I find, and this is in the title of the book, is that it's not an accident, it's the design that the people I study, policymakers, intellectuals at, oftentimes the, local and regional levels, all the way up to higher levels, what they explicitly understand themselves to be doing is trying to construct a mixed economy. And that was a really evocative term of its time. It's a term that's sort of lost today because it's not an ideal that really exists anymore, but it was an ideal that people used to think about capitalist orders in the mid-20th century. And it was this imagined path between socialism and laissez-faire being the two possibilities that you didn't want. And so, another way to think about it is that the path between the stylized ideals, highly stylized, of total state ownership or, pure private competition. And that meant that, a great deal was off the table in terms of, kind of egalitarian possibilities that would be smeared as socialist. And what it did is it created this really large space of possibility actually between those two poles, where capitalists had a lot of opportunity to avail themselves of all sorts of opportunities in the expansion of state functions. So you find, it's a characteristic virtue from the perspective of many policymakers to build the capacities of the state through collaboration with private capital. That's a vaunted alternative to socialist boogeymen. And I think that created a lot of opportunities basically for capital to insinuate really regressive possibilities into developmentalist statecraft. I've mentioned some of the examples in my book of, the way that for-profit educational contracting was actually used to build the US welfare state during the war on poverty, or the way in which these local Colombian capitalists seized state powers for themselves. They create a public enterprise that they're at the head of. And then, as I show, they use that power to mediate the way that land reform gets implemented in the Cauca Valley to just really steamroll and displace very large numbers of really, really poor people who you would think were supposed to be the beneficiaries of land reform, but in fact, land reform becomes an agribusiness program in this region of Colombia. So that's one problem, is just the anti-communism of the period that takes a lot of socialist opportunities off the table and ennobles public-minded capitalists who can claim that their interests are aligned with those of the nation. The other problem, I think, is the one that Christy pointed to, and that is the preference for growth in order to avoid dealing with problems of distribution. And I think that is the great untried possibility. There has been upward redistribution. There's been many experiments in upward redistribution in the history of the Americas. It's not called that, but that's what it is through, all sorts of public policies. But when it comes to programs that were designed to alleviate poverty and to raise living standards, there was never a commitment to actually really redistributing downward. And that's true in the United States, and that was true in Colombia. And instead, there's constantly this attempt to rely on growth to overcome that political limitation, essentially. One of the real sort of tragedies of that is that there are also areas of public policy where growth isn't even really attempted or it's not really used. So I find that, for instance, in the Alliance for Progress in the 60s in Colombia, not just in Colombia, but in general, the policy of the Alliance for Progress was this assumption that, look, what we want to prioritize is the pursuit of growth. And that means you need to concentrate your investments in the growth of industry, in increasing the productivity of agriculture, and in new infrastructure. And social welfare policy needs to be part of this. You need housing, you need education, you need healthcare, but you cannot put your money into that. It's just not the high priority. And so therefore you have the invention of all these extremely austere forms of social welfare provision. I look at these very austere build your own home programs in Colombia, in the United States, on Indian reservations that are growing up in a period that we think of as like, the problem is that they're so obsessed with growth. In this context, there isn't even a growing pie to fund this. And what they're trying to do basically is get people to take on huge amounts of unpaid labor, push costs onto the recipients of services themselves. And they're constructing forms of social welfare provision that are internally suited just as well to an era of fiscal retrenchment. So I think that the sort of the obsession with growth and the assumptions about what you need to create growth are really kind of tragic flaws of this moment.
Thank you so much. I know there are a lot of people waiting for in the Q&A, and I know Diane has a couple of questions. I just want to follow that thread and jump into another question, because I think this point that you both bring up of both distribution, but also of reinterpretation on the ground of these larger ideas prompts another question, because both your books are about construction and dismantling, and in a way of reinterpreting what is being dismantled on the ground, because governments that are, for example, intent on building and then compelled or prompted to dismantle what has been built. So I'd like to know, what were some of the unexpected findings for when your case study nations acted as active participants or architects of policy? And can you give an example of this? What were they able to achieve and not achieve in this attempt to redistribute or reinterpret or take back their ideas that had been launched into the world and then repackaged in a very different format back to them?
I think that's a really great question, and my book is just replete with examples of that, right? And so, two that come to mind immediately are the fight to create the InterAmerican Bank, which would have been the world's first multilateral development bank, right? Chartered through this process through the Pan American Union, would have actually been a sort of public investment development bank before such an idea existed. And then the second is in the attempt to create what was called the International Trade Organization, which is sort of a failed predecessor to today's WTO, that there's an attempt to create this international trade organization as they think of the third leg of the Bretton Woods institutions, right? We have the IMF to deal with currency stabilization. We have the World Bank to deal with kind of investment and lending. We have an international trade organization that's going to create new frameworks for international trade and investment between countries. And in both of those cases, right, Mexico and its allies from Latin America and the rest of the third world, they actually managed to kind of win great concessions in the negotiations, right? They get great large parts of their agenda, not all of it, but large parts of their agenda sort of written into the charters of these institutions. So the Havana Charter in 1948, the convention to establish the Inter-American Bank, both of these really have, Mexican and Latin American ideas coursing through them that are precisely about representation and redistribution, intended to use these kinds of international institutions to afford kind of more voice, more vote, and to redistribute capital from north to south. And what happens in both cases, and happens, to a considerable extent as well in the 1970s with the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, is that despite the fact that the Mexican state officials convinced their counterparts in the US government of the kind of logic and utility of their ideas, they are then vetoed by the power of organized capital, right? So to me, that was one of the surprising findings. If you just sort of read from the outcomes, right, you wouldn't find that, in fact, the Mexicans had managed to kind of to undertake these skillful negotiations to really reform and change and create new institutions in this way, because neither of those institutions eventually comes into being, because they're blocked by the power of organized business, or actual business organizations who managed to get them not ratified in the US Congress, for example. So that kind of that move to build up those institutions and get the US government to agree to it, only to see it kind of blocked by the retrenchment of capital, is a pattern that I follow throughout the whole book. And that's one thing that I think about with regard to that question.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And Amy?
It's really interesting. In a lot of ways, I think that my work is about actually conflict within nations, within societies, where it's not necessarily that the Colombian state pursues a program that gets thrown back at it, but that actually there's rival, social formations within Colombia, and a lot of class conflict that's taking place within Colombia that has the effect actually of throwing out multiple ideas into the international sphere. And so it's often a case where Colombians are actually trying to use international institutions and international debates to fight a battle at home and beat back a proposal from one of their domestic rivals. So to give you an example, actually, overall, I'm really struck in my research by the extent to which Colombian elites really controlled the way that international aid functioned locally. And this is one thing that I think is underestimated by a vision of empire in which, empire is about the southward projection of power. No question about it. Southward projection of power is very important, but it's Colombian capitalists and to some extent government officials as well, often those same people, who are there on the ground, and they're the ones who determine what the money actually goes to, and actually have the most power to implement it. And I find, for instance, that in US attempts to build up economics education in Latin America, it turns out that actually there's local businessmen who basically want to build up the business schools in Colombia and in Latin America, and they very intelligently and very capably avail themselves of the flood of international assistance that's coming into Colombia to build up basically the not just the business school itself, but they're trying to demonstrate the ability of businessmen to serve as the stewards of the state more generally. And they use the public university as like a proving ground that they can manage the public university. Business is a legitimate profession. And then they start to look out from the public university and make the case for businessmen as statesmen more generally, and for the profit motive as something that improves public administration. One of the consequences of that is that it shapes class conflict within Colombia, but it also has international consequences. One of the organizations I look at, which is originally just this very small foundation that's designed to channel international funds to one specific business school in the city of Cali at the Universidad del Valle, becomes actually over time redeployed and made into basically a think tank that is supplying the US government with the arguments that it takes to international conferences to argue against the new international economic order. And so what strikes me is actually how influential Colombians can be in the international sphere, but that Colombians don't have any single idea about how the international economy should be ordered. And those power struggles often happen through international arenas.
Thank you so much for that. I have so many questions about sovereignty and how these, who are we talking about when we're talking about these countries as perceived, but I'm seeing my co-chair here dinging her chat hand. So Diane, I pass it on to you and then you can pass the baton back to me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Amy and Christy, for this presentation. I want to apologize in advance. Amy, I didn't get a chance to read your book. And I read Christy's with great interest because I do a lot of work on Mexico myself, but I guess I wanted to make a comment that leads to a question. And it really is a way of kind of turning the discussion a bit away from the crisis of capitalism or how capitalism works and a little more into state formation and politics. So the first thing I would say is what I loved about both presentations is the way in which you look at the kind of interrelationship between the countries and the US. The negotiation, the kind of phenomenology of these political negotiations over time, that create institutions, which then in a way bite them back, or at least in the Mexican case, the institutions bite them back. But what's interesting, and so both of these presentations are about that. But what strikes me about Amy's presentation is that in Colombia ends up in a very different place in a way than Mexico does. And I might even add that the Colombians dominate the IADB and the rhetoric. It's not just a decentralization is a part of dismantling of the welfare state in the United States, even though I buy the argument that in a way they create this power to impose a different agenda of development than even Mexico. So I guess to me, the question is, what is the nature of politics and the political process in the two countries that created these different outcomes, where they're now part of the same system, but it doesn't really work well for them? And if I might, so that's my question, if I might say a little, throw something on the table, that it is not, what I loved about the Christy, your book is like going back to the period right after the revolution, early before the Bucharest Treaty, et cetera, even before World War II, and looking at the ways in which the struggle for state formation pushed the Mexican government to make deals with capitalists, both US and Mexican capitalists, because of foreign debt, intervention, et cetera, that laid the foundation for then later when Cardenas comes in, there's a little more opportunity to kind of negotiate because the US needed Mexico for industrialization, for World War II, that created these institutions. So the question then, and then when you just one last thing I want to say, you get, but the vicissitudes of Mexican politics are such that they're back and forth on this. So after Cardenas, then you get Avila, Camacho, get Diaz Ordaz, et cetera. Then you end with Echeverria. And the other thing that I want to add or ask the question that links me to Colombia. Yeah, okay. It's one last question that Colombia, Mexico did not successfully decentralize. So the whole thing was about a struggle for centralization of state power, whereas in Colombia, they decentralized because of the nature of politics there. So I guess I would like a little more about something beyond capitalism that's explaining these two outcomes.
Thanks so much, Diane. And I invite you both to answer one or two of those. I know Diane threw a series of you, and then we have so many questions in the Q&A, and I still have a couple more that I want to follow up with from your comments.
I'll start really briefly. One of the things that I think my book tries to insist on is that decentralization doesn't have a timeless definition, actually, and it's an idea with a really long history, and it's a tradition that I guess it's not a tradition. It's a concept that Americans, and I mean Americans in the hemispheric sense, have used to refer actually to many forms of state restructuring that often we wouldn't recognize as decentralizing at all. Nobody remembers these mid-century river valley development agencies as models of decentralization. They are, from our perspective, the central state expanding its functions. They're not autonomous in a way that we would recognize. And so in that sense, actually, I think that actually there's much more to know about the way that the concept of decentralization has been actually conceptualized and deployed in American societies in ways that actually might not be mutually intelligible and don't look the same. So for instance, Colombia, it's not even a federal state, it's a unitary state. And what qualifies as decentralization in Colombia probably wouldn't even qualify in Brazil or something. And so I agree with you that, Colombian decentralization never looks like Mexican decentralization. But there's ways in which, the Colombian state was, kind of never, even at the start of this story, was notoriously very weak, had no reach into the regions and so on and so forth. But Colombianists would say, oh, the Colombian state was highly centralized because the Constitution of 1886 provides for political centralization. So what's interesting to me, just to be clear, is the stories actually and the lessons that people are taking, where they are constantly reinterpreting what qualifies, I guess, as centralism and decentralization. And in this period, I do find that the context of anti-communism, the context of the Cold War, inspires many people to describe themselves as defenders of decentralization and to read whatever project they're involved in as a model of it, because centralism is so often kind of smeared as being associated with like Soviet central planning and so on and so forth. So I think it's historically, it has been a more flexible concept than we might imagine, which is not to say that all countries take forms that we would regard as decentralized. But I think if we want to think about where that concept comes from, what its potentialities are, and why we arrive at this point where it's sort of this neoliberal common sense, that's worth considering.
That's really great. And I'm really interested to be pushed to think about this comparison of decentralization in both Colombia and Mexico. It's not a frame that I had considered before, but it seems like an obvious one. And I wish very much that I could, sort of hand the mic off to someone I see in the audience, who is Susan Gauss, who is, one of the foremost historians of kind of some of the regional differentiations in how industrialization takes off in Mexico. And I would say that, one thing that I've learned from Susan's work is frequently the politics that are operative in thinking about, what kinds of plans should be pursued are precisely these kinds of inter-regional conflicts, right? So the kind of industrialist associations associated with Mexico City and manufacturing in Mexico City, fighting against the, sort of interests of the industrialist associations further in the north in Monterrey, and then eventually along the border, right? And so the kinds of conflicts within the business class itself, within the industrialist class in Mexico, are obviously very operative. And here, the kind of question of how that shapes, for instance, economics training in Mexico is something that I take from the sociologist Sarah Babb. The extent to which, as Amy was saying, right, the kind of promotion of particular kinds of economics departments that serve particular kinds of industrial interests is something that's also operative here in the kind of domestic sphere. I try to be attentive to, and one thing that I learned sort of thinking about methodology is I try to be attentive to the ways in which domestic political struggle, particularly struggle, class-based mobilization of industrialists, of workers' organizations, right, of political parties, the ways in which these things are influencing and refracting on these kinds of international negotiations, because they are frequently really separate, right? It's not as though people going to these international meetings are explicitly saying like, well, there was a riot yesterday in Mexico City about the ITO, so we can't pursue this particular policy because, David Siqueiro got arrested and, is riling up all of the communists in the streets of the capital. But, that is frequently what's happening. And so I tried to be pretty attentive to those kinds of domestic political economic considerations, thinking about class conflict, thinking about intra-class conflict as drivers of, as in our understanding of sort of how history moves forward, right? As drivers of why particular policies are pursued at the moments that they are. One thing that I think that's interesting about that, sort of Diane, your kind of narration of the arc of kind of Mexican politics and the changes that happen is that as Gabriela was saying in the beginning, when she was introducing this, one of the things that's interesting is this kind of stratum of state officials who straddle those borders, straddle those kinds of typical political and historiographic markers, right? So people who stay on from the Cárdenas period through to Ávila Camacho and are still there under Alemán, right? Going to these international meetings, et cetera. And you see that in the earlier period as well, right? Alberto Jotopani just shows up at literally every moment internationally for Mexico, through a broad sweep of different and kind of warring factions of the Mexican post-revolutionary state. So that's another thing that I think is really interesting, is how even in these kinds of moments of political turmoil and upheaval and change, you can have this kind of class of economic experts, diplomatic experts who kind of straddle those lines, who cross those kinds of dividing lines. And I tried to be attentive to that in my book as well.
Thank you so much for that, Christy. What you just said at the end reminds me of Hodge's book, The Triumph of the Expert, where he's talking about these experts in the agricultural fields of Africa. And when the empire dies, the bureaucrats don't. So the bureaucrats go off and look for jobs in global institutions, carrying with them these ideas of colonialism and empire. And it's this wheel that is in some ways unending. But I want to have a couple more questions before we open it up to the many questions in the Q&A. And this is a question about the 1970s, and you both touched on it in your response to Diane. And in both your books, the 1970s play a significant role as a moment of deep rupture. Can you position each of your stories within this era and explain why the 70s are so significant for the world order, but also for Mexico and for Colombia? What is it about this moment in each of your particular cases that reflect something that's going on much deeper in each of your national cases? Did you want to start us off, Amy?
Sure. Well, Colombia in the 1970s, I mean, this is sort of a moment of crisis. Colombia, it's hard to say that there's a decade where it's not a moment of crisis, but certainly in the 1970s, I mean, the National Front, this power sharing agreement between the liberal and conservative parties is coming to an end. There's a wave of civic strikes. There's a great deal of social upheaval and also extreme repression by the late 1970s by the national government. By the 1980s, then you have sort of mounting issues with, the growth of drug trafficking, cocaine as sort of a new phenomenon in Colombian economic and political and just sort of social reality. So the state is coming to experience a very extreme crisis of legitimacy that mounts, through the 1970s and 1980s. That, goes hand in hand with the sort of generalized pressures about the sort of international crises that we know happen in the 1970s, from the sort of oil shocks to, the debt crisis by the early 1980s, the fall of the Soviet Union. This is sort of a period of international crisis that compounds some of those domestic crises. I mean, Colombia never had the kind of levels of international debt that Mexico did, but it suffers with all of Latin America when the whole region gets cut off. And so those are the kinds of pressures that inspire, of course, the national government to throw up in the state, by the late 80s and early 90s, and start to, write dramatically new laws that restructure the public sector, write a completely new constitution. And so the sort of standard narrative of Colombian history is that this is a dramatic rupture. And by 1991, you have kind of the state reinvented. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think that what my book tries to do is think about some of the continuities and think about some of the kind of deep origins of the solutions that are proposed in those periods. And I think that, there's those continuities can take so many different forms. I don't want to belabor this, but in some ways I kind of think of my book as one that doesn't deny that anybody who lived through those decades was not in the same world at the end of them. There really is a very profound transformation that, is experienced from the level of the workplace to, the level of like the structure of representation in the government. There's profound transformations that take place. But I do think that, we can find actually many of the origins of the ideas that are used to restructure the state in basically a reconfiguration and reimagining of some of the tools that were originally used to build the developmental state. Christy, what would you say?
The 70s are just this like incredibly fascinating period in Mexico, right? And one of the difficulties of studying this moment in Mexico is that, for instance, because Luis Echeverria is still, holding on in his hospital bed, he's still alive. We saw him kind of wheeled out into the National Stadium to get his COVID shot, actually, which was a moment of big crisis in Mexico because he hadn't been seen in public for so long. His papers remain uncatalogued, unorganized. They are deposited in the National Archives in one of those, big rooms in the prison in Lecumberri, but they're completely unorganized, and accessibility to research is really difficult. I've done some research in them despite that, like dug through some very unorganized boxes to start thinking more deeply about this moment of the 1970s in Mexico and why I think it's so important. And the real paradox for this moment, and particularly for the thing that I'm interested in, right, is that the 1970s presents this moment in Mexico where you have two simultaneous movements. One is Echeverria's movement toward the third world, his kind of taking up the mantle that had been really started by Lopez Mateos, as Eric Zoloff has really gotten into in detail, to sort of make Mexico a champion of and a part of the third world, right? So you have strong defense of, for instance, the Cuban Revolution, of the Chilean road to socialism, right? Allende comes and gives a speech in Mexico City. Echeverria goes to Santiago de Chile to defend the Chilean road to socialism, and does so at the UN as well. You have all of that going on. at the same time that you have this system of brutal and violent and massive repression of the domestic left that would see itself as a piece of the formation with the Cuban Revolution, the Chilean road to socialism, right? And so the kind of brutal suppression of student movements, of guerrilla movements in the countryside, of peasant movements. And we have tons of amazing history about that. The new book by Shane Dillingham on Oaxaca really gets at some of these really important moments. And so to me, that paradox is really key. And I find the solution to the paradox between how could we have Echeverria sort of facing the third world and standing up for Castro and arguing at the UN that Chile must be defended, right? At the same time that he is murdering guerrilla leaders and, you know, sending halcones out into the street to, you know, paddle student protesters with poles. And I find the answer to that question in precisely the kind of developmental model that he's trying to pursue. Echeverria is walking this line in the 1970s where he's saying to the United States, and you find this in the US archives, right? You find this in the papers of the State Department. He's saying to the United States, like, look, if you don't do it my way, if you don't follow the Echeverria path, this thing that is the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, and it's kind of this more moderate, like, you have to give us some concessions. We have permanent sovereignty over natural resources. We have to be able to control multinational corporations, make our own laws. Like, we need an international framework for this. If you don't do it my way, right, you're going to have 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams. You're going to continue to have these revolutionary movements going on. And so he comes to Washington. There are these incredible files where Echeverria is sitting down with Nixon and Kissinger and saying to them, like, look, not only if you don't do it my way, you're going to get more Cubas. And I'm going to prove to you that I am better than anybody else at repressing internal dissent here at home. And so he frequently, he looks at Nixon and Kissinger in the face and he references Tlatelolco, right? Not by name, but he says specifically, like, I am better at repressing these movements than anybody else. And so, you know, do it my way. And so the kind of recourse to his particular vision, a kind of corporatist tripartite structure is how the Mexicans think of it, right? The state is the mediator between labor, business, state interests. It's all controlled through him in this single party, soft authoritarian corporatist state. He's saying that's the model. That's the model to make it so that you don't have more revolutions, and I'm the guy to do it, right? And so to me, that is the fascinating thing about Mexico in the 1970s, as it is thrown into, as Amy was saying, these broader global crises. The crisis of 1971 is incredibly important in Mexico because not only does the United States take the dollar off of gold, right? It levies this import surcharge. It says 10% surtax on imports. And immediately that has a huge impact on Mexico's export economy, which the border industrialization program was begun 5 years earlier, right? And so that the sort of international crises into which Mexico is then thrown in the middle of this incredible struggle in Mexico, I think just makes it a really fascinating and really important period in Mexican history.
Christy, that's so interesting. And it's so important because I agree, for a while when I could not reach the Echeverria files, I became an Echeverria file, literally trying to find anything I could in the archives. And one thing that comes out so clearly is that his visions might have continued had the crisis not happened. But that's a conversation that we can have at a different point, because he was creating the infrastructure that would go deep so that they would carry on well after him. And but then we have the crisis, which leads me to my final question before I really do open it up to the floor. And it has to do with crises, because both your books begin in different time periods. We have Christy, yours that's beginning right after World War I, and Amy right after World War II. And these are moments when we get to ponder global governance, prompted by a series of events. But we're right now at another moment of crisis. And it's not a world war, but rather it is a global pandemic, and it is a climate crisis. Are we at a moment, and this, I'm really interested in your points of view as scholars, as historians, in which this way of reorganizing the world, of reinterpreting, redistributing what we have, are we at another moment, such as the ones that you discuss in your books?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I don't think that there's been a moment like this since the 1930s. Maybe the 1970s, but I think the 1930s, when people were asking in such fundamental ways what the future of political economic order would be, when the existing order was so profoundly discredited. And I think that we also have the benefit of living in a post-Cold War world. And to be sure, the Cold War is not really dead, but it's deader than it used to be. And the possibilities for thinking about socialism today are far more expansive than they've been in some time. And I think that, you know, what is striking to me when I look at the world that I'm studying is the limits of imagination and the limits of what was possible. And I think that, you know, what's fascinating today is the sense that, you know, one doesn't have to be kind of Pollyanna, and one doesn't even have to be really optimistic to recognize that there are possibilities that are imaginable, arguable, and really part of political contestation today that are far to the left of what could find a place in national politics in Colombia and the United States during the sort of Cold War years that I'm looking at. The other thing that I find very interesting today is the memory, actually, and the invocation of this past and the way that's functioning now. I think it's really interesting that, for instance, the New Deal is being kind of resuscitated as a model for thinking through our possibilities today, the idea of a Green New Deal, for instance. And in the book, I actually study this sort of form of historical memory, or offer some thoughts about it towards the end of the book. This is an example of what I call sorting out the mixed economy. The practices that coexisted in the mid-century period, which pointed really towards many futures, some of which were could be seeds of neoliberalism, some of which could be seeds of social democracy. Those had kind of inchoate and indeterminate meanings in the mid-century period. People assigned a lot of different meanings to them. So these austere homeownership programs, for instance, some people thought that they were wedges actually to open up the welfare state to create the seeds of new forms of social democracy. And other people thought that this was a great alternative to public housing that would show that private homeownership and sweat equity was the only way forward. People backed them for different reasons, and by the late 20th century, they become neoliberal instruments, which they really hadn't been before. And I find that, you know, as different elements of the mid-century mixed economy become sorted from each other, some get destroyed and annihilated, others get kind of repurposed and reimagined and politically resignified. There's also a process of remembering, where the ones that become resignified and imagined as neoliberal instruments, their earlier lives are forgotten, and the mid-century period gets kind of evacuated of what I see as its least egalitarian elements. They get sort of imagined as these post-70s inventions, and they get called purely neoliberal. That's a form of historical memory that, you know, the evacuation of the past, the sort of simplification of the past, the construction of mid-century capitalism as this kind of just antagonistic antecedent to neoliberalism, that actually can be very politically productive. And I am not out to yell at anybody who remembers that way, because what it's actually doing right now in people sort of talking about a Green New Deal in the United States is giving people like an imagined vision actually of what a more just order could be. They're not actually making literal claims about what the past was. The past wasn't that at all, but they're selecting out elements of the past and adapting them to construct an image of the future that I hope we get to live in. So I think it's an interesting time, and I think that historical memory is actually a big part of how people are dealing with this crisis.
I think that's great, and I completely agree, Amy. I will just say, you know, from my perspective, sort of strange confluence of events has led me to work pretty closely since the publication of my book with some representatives of the Mexican Foreign Service. And so I've been having these meetings led by the Mexican ambassador to the Kingdom of Norway and the Mexican ambassador to the OECD and a number of Mexican diplomats who are, in fact, they read my book and they found that they were very interested in this history that they actually didn't know about Mexican foreign relations. And just this morning, actually, I was in a meeting convened by the embassy in Norway with a group of activists and academics and NGO leaders who are trying to imagine what they're calling a new system of global public investment. And they asked me to come talk to them in the interest of getting the Mexican state involved in kind of advocating for precisely the kind of new system that was so often the kind of the imaginary that was on the table in these earlier moments. And so that to me tells me that we are in this moment where things have changed radically enough that we see the kind of attempt to once again sort of seize the moment of crisis and go forward. And so I will say that, as there were in the 20th century following these kinds of other important moments of upheaval, now we have these Mexican diplomats going to these meetings in Europe and arguing once again for rethinking kind of the system of aid and development and global public investment, and talking about, what are, in the context of climate change and in the context of the pandemic, what are the kind of global public goods that we need to finance? And how will we do that collectively? How do we bring countries across the world together to do that, to recognize that? And so there's actual organizing work that's going on along that front right now. I'm very lucky to be a sort of historical observer and consultant to some of that process. So it's absolutely happening as we speak, and that the vision of this as a kind of an analog crisis moment is being mobilized by these state actors as we speak.
Christy, I think that's so important to have a historian sitting at the decision-making table, because the ability to bring together all of these narratives, because both of you really push forward this idea of the importance of storytelling and in the importance of who is the storyteller when it comes to how we envision a global economic world. So I want to just very quickly go to our Q&A, and there's a question from Niels Jacobson. Did developmentalist visions in Mexico and Colombia precede specific policies born out of current political economic constellations, or follow such policies? For example, the need to fomenting industries because of the failure of the export economy.
Well, sort of Christy, I'll start, and then you can, contribute. Correct. I mean, the traditional understanding, which I think is strong, is that basically, if you're thinking about the Great Depression is sort of the beginning for my book, and the Great Depression, really does shatter people's. It forces people to look for a new pattern of economic activity, and what becomes thought of as, ISI starts out as experimental policies, and the theory follows after that. And I think that, the kind of world that I'm looking at in Colombia in the years after 1945 is definitely that world in which people are, have a really searching relationship to theory, actually, and they have a relatively searching, within these confines, a relatively searching relationship to practice as well. What grounds their search is the pursuit of economic growth. But there's actually, I think, more doctrinal variety. If not everybody's a structuralist, and oftentimes the debates are not most heated between like the structuralists and the neoclassicals, but they're debates that involve much wider publics. The line that Gabriela quoted at the beginning, I'm really interested in like the popularization of economic reasoning and the participation of very broad publics whose lives were being touched by development policies, by housing policies, by land reform. I'm really interested in the kind of the pressures that come from them, the way that they use their homes, the way that they divert public policies. So I do see development as a highly contested idea, both at the kind of theoretical level and the practical level. But I do see it as something that arises initially from the experience of crisis and the very practical need to look for some new policies when you cannot get those, foreign markets and foreign investment that, Latin America had relied on in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, one of the points that I make in the book is the extent to which, Mexico has to kind of strike out and think about new ways of organizing global finance because they're shut out of the global financial system, right? During the revolution, they repudiate a lot of debt and destroy a lot of property owned by foreign property owners and foreign banks. They basically managed to contract one additional loan during the revolutionary ferment, and then again, repudiate that, default on that very quickly. And so really from 1914 all the way up until the early 1940s, Mexico is shut out of that system. And so for that reason, they begin to kind of argue for new ways of organizing the global economy. Now, at the same time, the Mexican state is you know, coming up with new ways to actually organize the national economy and making arguments about, you know, state-directed industrialization, et cetera, and sort of what the changes in the agricultural sector will look like. But there is very much a sense that, you know, it is born of the necessity of whatever the kind of political economic configuration in the moment, that they pursue policies that then get sort of, you know, narrated and turned into these kinds of theoretical perspectives. You know, two things that I think are really interesting about studying developmentalism in Mexico is that Mexico, no Mexican economist forms part of what we think of as kind of the Latin American developmental canon. Right? We read Furtado, we read, you know, Fernando Enrique Cardoso, we read this whole host of people from Chile and Prebisch, Argentina, Brazil, et cetera. And, you know, we don't read, for instance, Eduardo Villaseñor or even Victor Urquidi, who are, you know, these men who are involved in those same kinds of discussions over and over again, but they don't produce this kind of body of theory that we come to think of as the Latin American developmentalist canon. And you could argue, for instance, that by the time we get into the 1960s and the kind of state theorists of stabilizing development, right, that doesn't enter the kind of canon of developmentalist theory. They are writing these ideas down, they're making the case for them, but that's kind of it's not making a big international splash. The one place where I see the kind of practice in Mexico and the ideas, the kind of theorizing through practice in Mexico really having a kind of really important effect in the Latin American developmentalist canon is there's this really telling moment in the biography of Raúl Prebisch, right, by Eduardo Dosman. And he talks about how in 1944, in precisely this moment when the Mexicans are arguing about the Bretton Woods institutions and how they will approach them, Prebisch shows up in Mexico City for this series of seminars convened by Victor Urquidi and Daniel Cosío Villegas and these famous Mexican economists and economic thinkers. And there's this moment in the Prebisch biography where he says that basically it's in these seminars where he learns to begin to thinking about the problems of the Latin American economy as distinct from the problems of the Argentine economy, right? Up to that point in 1944, Prebisch was like really consumed with the problems that had racked the Argentine economy, which is obviously very different from what the economy looked like in Colombia, from what the economy looked like in Mexico. So Prebisch says this thing that he goes to these seminars, and that's where he begins to have the germs of the seeds for what will become his kind of structuralist vision of the problems of the overall Latin American economy. But we don't get the narrative from the Mexican economists who were there, you know, sort of putting those ideas in practice. We get Prebisch's theory, right? And so in some sense, I'm really interested in kind of rehabilitating the actual theorizing through negotiation and in practice in these negotiations as an important contribution to developmentalist thought itself, even though it doesn't emerge as one of these kind of treatises of the Latin American developmentalist canon.
Oh, thank you both for that. I want to really thank both of you for really pushing us to rethink how we think about the making of our world, but also to rethink how we can now remake a world in the 21st century. And I think you give us, if not necessarily the blueprints, which as we learn were so difficult and often copied and miscopied, but rather the questions that we need to ask as we move forward into the 21st century. So if you haven't already, please run out and buy these, read them. If you read them together, it's a real treat. And I want to invite you, both my colleague Diane Davids and I invite you to our next seminar, Wednesday, September 22nd, when we'll be talking about Los Otros, race, norms, corruption, and immigration in Mexico, a discussion with Pablo Yankelevich. And it will be, we'll have the series of events, including later on, Mario Luna, the Yaqui Secretario General, who will be talking about water wars and the attacks against the Yaqui for control of water, also this coming semester. Please join me in thanking Amy Offner and Christy Thornton for really engaged and rich conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you. This was fun.
Thanks so much for organizing. Really fantastic.